All right. Welcome, beautiful souls, to another episode of the Faith, Fitness, Joy podcast. I am your host, Rochelle Renee. I am also a health coach and energy healer. It is Wonderful Wednesday, and today I have a beautiful channeled podcast episode for you. I received this episode via download last night. And so today's episode is called Take Up Your Cross and Follow Me, the deeper meaning behind Yeshua's words in the Bible passage from Matthew chapter 16, verses 24 to 26. So this is what we're honing in on, what I'm diving deeper in today for this podcast episode. This is really going to resonate for those of you who recognize yourselves as the chosen ones, the generational curse breakers, those of you that are on a spiritual path, who have been working on your spiritual growth, deepening your connection to God in whatever way you conceive of God. This is not about a specific religious belief system or faith. This is about your spiritual growth and your spiritual connection, and following that path of spiritual ascension and raising your consciousness. So this is really who today's episode is sort of kind of geared towards. It doesn't mean, obviously, that if you want to stay and listen and tune in, that's totally fine as well. It just may not resonate for you. And I'm not going to go super deep into a lot of some of these concepts that I just mentioned, but I will touch on some of them and give sort of at least a high level definition, because God has also made very clear to me that part of this is to help people who are maybe earlier in their spiritual healing or their spiritual growth journey. Those of you that maybe are just beginning with doing some of that inner healing work, shadow work, maybe you're starting to feel called to deepening your connection with God. Maybe you're starting to feel called to connect to the deeper, more spiritual part of yourself. And so that is also part of what today's episode is designed to help with, and give some clarification around, but also for those of us that have been doing this for some time. So we're going to kind of, like I said, go over briefly a little bit about some of these things I mentioned about what is it being a chosen one, what is being on the spiritual path, what does that, kind of mean, and who really is kind of in that category. A little bit about that, and then we'll go over sort of the verse that this is really exploring and going deeper into, the sort of revelation that God gave me last night around this specific verse and what it really means, and the importance of doing our inner healing and our shadow work. So all that being said, couple housekeeping things for today. If you haven't already, please make sure you like and subscribe to the podcast, as well as the YouTube channel. You can find me on YouTube under Rochelle Renee or at _faith fitness joy _. Unfortunately, I've had a couple different channels due to some unfortunate events that happened with my original channel. So that is why the current title. Also, thank you to all of you loyal listeners and those of you who tune in regularly. I really appreciate you continuing to listen into the episodes and the podcast. And if you like this podcast and you find it helpful, please consider supporting the podcast. I will include a link where you can make a monetary contribution if you feel led, in the comments on the Facebook Live, as well as in the YouTube and the episode descriptions for the podcast. It really helps me continue to deliver content and different topics related to health and wellness and spiritual growth and mindset shifting and all of these things that I talk about on this podcast. So all that being said, let's get into today's topic. So first of all, what do I mean when I'm talking about the chosen ones or the generational curse breakers? How do you know if that's you? Those of you that have been on this path for some time, so for example, I've been in my healing journey for about 2.5 years now. So I've come to understand this very well and what it really means. And those of you that have been doing this for some time, you probably already know that you are the generational curse breaker in your family. You probably already know that you're the chosen one. from your family. And what that essentially means is, the person that has been the soul, more specifically, the soul that has been called by your family before you incarnate in this life to clear the line of all the different past transgressions, pain, trauma, sins, if you will, for lack of a better term, or in other cultures and traditions, it's conceived of as karma. So in the Bible, it's talked about as iniquity. And that's basically in the Bible, in the biblical sense, it's inherited sin. It's these things that we inherit. A good example of this are things like alcoholism or substance abuse is one example of things that we know at a scientific level are genetically passed down. But this it's more than just that. So there's a number of different types of things that we inherit, that we come into this world with maybe a little bit more of an inclination to, just because of our family line and our DNA. And a lot of this is actually in our DNA, even things that may be falling more into the spiritual kind of category of topics or concepts, if you will. But this is stuff that science is beginning to been able to prove and provide evidence supporting. So it's very real. And so that's a little bit about what the chosen ones and the generational curse breakers are. You may also have always felt like you never fit in. You may be the black sheep in your family or in just a larger community. Like in my case, I was targeted from a pretty young age at school. I never fit in. I was bullied pretty substantially, physically and verbally. And so a lot of you may have similar experiences where you just experience maybe a lot of trial or pain or trauma, feeling like an outcast, feeling maybe alone or kind of like the lone wolf, or just, again, the black sheep or the square peg, in any situation or group or anything like that you found yourself in. And as unpleasant as it may be to kind of have to hear, it is in some ways by design, because it's part of sort of forming you. God's giving me the word refinement right now. Like, so this process of refinement, where we go through these things and we are placed through a lot of, we are kind of called or moved towards a lot of these things that I was just describing, and other things that happen in our lives that feel like very heavy trials or tribulations or painful experiences, but they're all in preparation. They're all things that are really meant to prepare us for sort of this this time, for those of us that are in this like spiritual growth season right now. So just checking on comments here. Hello, thank you for joining live. Appreciate you joining me and tuning in to today's podcast episode. Okay, so that's what I wanted to just briefly recap a little bit about what that means and who I'm talking about. And again, a lot of people are, I'm seeing this a lot online and in different either private groups I'm in or on different social media platforms. More and more people are starting to seek this out and maybe pursuing their inner healing, or feeling led to connect to God in a deeper way, or pursue like a connection with their soul and the spiritual part of themselves. So that's another reason that God called me to talk about this today. So shifting gears a little bit, because I was thinking about all of this last night for whatever reason. I'm kind of always processing this on some level or in some way, off and on. And I was kind of just thinking about being the generational curse breaker, a lot of the things that I have moved through and worked through in my own journey, which is also what ultimately led me about maybe a year and a half ago to start developing my spiritual gifts and start tapping into those. And God starting to make it very clear that part of my calling is to really step into the role as a healer. And helping me understand my abilities with that. And so part of that is one of the things I do as a healer, whether I am in a private session with a client doing some sort of a healing service for them, or if I am placed in settings where there are people who need some sort of a clearing, that is part of what I do, and that's part of what I'm here to do. And that can look different ways for different people that have a similar calling. But part of it is processing and alchemizing and transmuting some of these heavier, more negative energies. And as you continue to improve your spiritual well-being, you do your own inner healing work, and you progress on your spiritual path, and sort of complete most of your healing work. I don't like to say complete, because it's an ongoing process. It's not like you do this one time and then it's all fixed and perfect, but you do get to a place where more of the intensive phase of it is completed, and then you are in a better position to start to do this for other people. And I've learned in my own journey, it requires me to have a very keen awareness of myself, my own energy, but also when I'm around other people, because I've started to learn that if I'm not paying attention and I don't have a good awareness around that, I'm picking things up from other people, and I'm transmuting things for other people, which is part of what I'm here to do. But sometimes it can be confusing, because you're not always conscious of what is yours or not yours. So that's another important aspect of it. But so all that to say, I was kind of thinking about all this and processing this, and there were some things that have happened in recent weeks where I've realized that a lot of what I've been moving through and working through has not been my own, and has been, things I've picked up from other people, or, God's also revealed to me that I am starting to do this on a much more large scale, and more for the collective, as many of us are also doing. So some of it, for those of you that are also healers, or that are also light workers in some form or fashion, heightening your awareness of that, and making you aware that this is part of the kind of the time and the season that we're in and that we're moving into, to be more aware of that for yourselves. But as I was thinking about all of this, I started to have this conversation with God last night about, like, what does this really mean? Because I understand He's made it clear to me at earlier points in my journey that, when you're doing your healing work, one of the things is that you are healing all of your ancestors who have been before you, right? So your parents, your grandparents, great grandparents, blah, blah, all the way back, as far as you're connected, but also your children and future generations as well. But then I was kind of pondering, well, how far does this ripple out? Is it like aunts and uncles and cousins? Is it, I mean, like what is this kind of ripple of this? And so the answer God gave me was that it's everyone in your bloodline, all of those who you're related to by blood, before and after you. And then to that response, I asked him, so does that mean that all this work that I've done and cleared, is it like extending to aunts and uncles and other people further out? Like, how does that work? And what about, like, as time is moving on, and we're all progressing in our own lives? So he said, all of the iniquity or inherited sin or karma, you've cleared all of that. And it's clearing all of these things that have been sort of in the things that have been passed down through the DNA, like I was talking about earlier, the things that are inherited, the things that have passed through the family lines. But at the same time, we are all accruing our own karma, if you will, or we're accruing potentially new iniquity as we move along in our lives. So anything that different people in your family are doing in that regard is kind of outside of this, is what he was making clear to me. But it's more about the things that you've brought into the world that have been inherited and passed down the family line. So then he made it clear that, this is why the healing work is so very important, and why we are called to do the healing work. And I know for myself, when I first started to read the Bible, and when I was going to a Christian church many years ago, I had a very different understanding of a lot of things in the Bible. And it's not to say those things are necessarily wrong, but God has given me deeper, different understandings of a lot of things about the Bible, and things that are in the Bible. And now it's become very clear to me that there are so many parts of the Bible that are very emphatic about the importance of doing this healing work. This is why things like forgiveness are spoken about so much in the Bible, why it talks so much about not being attached to the material and the things of this world, and where God says, be not of this world, the importance of strengthening our spirit. There's the passages about the armor of God and putting on the full armor of God. That's all about spiritual strength. It's all about sort of quieting your flesh or your body or your ego and really strengthening the spiritual parts of ourselves, which a lot of us aren't really taught. I know I wasn't, not really. I think there's a lot of, I'm not sure what the right word is, but I guess teachings or practices that I've experienced in churches I've been in, that just, I don't know, some of these things that God has led me to understand more recently were not as clear to me in some of those practices. It's the other thing emphasized in the Bible, the importance of a relationship with God. And, it's like really emphasizing that in particular. It's not going to church is not a relationship with God. That's fine. It's not that going to church is good or bad, but the point is there's a lot of people I think that maybe think that's what it looks like, or that that's sufficient. And that is not a relationship with God. It's we are all called to have our own personal daily relationship with God. The other concepts in the Bible that have been even more, I guess, emphasized in this past couple of years that I've been in this spiritual healing journey, are also gratitude and unconditional love. So taking it back a little bit to the topic, the name of today's episode, which is an excerpt from this passage that I'm about to read from Matthew chapter 16, verses 24 to 26. If anyone would follow me, let me pull it up on here because I have the full chapter. If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. For what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his soul? Or what shall a man give in return for his soul? So this is getting at what a lot of us tend to be very attached to the things of the world. And I know I've definitely been, that has been me up until very recently. And when I had this conversation with God last night, it was very clear to me that this is part of why I've been in this 2-year-long tower moment where literally every aspect of my life has been stripped away. And it's slowly been one thing removed after another thing after another thing. And I've come to realize over this time, with all this reflection and being very close to God, and leaning very much on God to move me through this time, because it has been a very difficult time. I don't want to get emotional, but it has been. And it has been a walk in faith. But it's become clear to me through these recent months, and especially through this conversation with God last night, that a lot of the reason for that is because I was too attached to the things of the world. I had too much of my identity over the last decades of my life before I've moved into this season that were wrapped up in what I did for a living, what I had, what people thought of me, how good a job I did at X, Y, or Z, what I looked like, whether I was living up to some societal standard of beauty or fitness or whatever, the comparison traps that a lot of us fall into, trying to make it, so to speak, the keeping up with the Joneses concept, all of these things, we all have our different collection of these different things that we have in that sense, in that aspect. And so over this last couple of years, it's been a series of, every relationship in my life being stripped away. The home that I had built in California before moving to Montana, this whole career I had built, that I thought I was going to kind of like continue and just move into, find a different job in the same type of field. God had other plans. That was not the way things went. So I had my own idea and plans of how things were going to go. But as I got out here, none of it transpired the way that I thought. And it's been like this process of me trying to reestablish something that felt normal, and reestablishing what I thought I was supposed to be doing, while at the same time God has been trying to lead me towards what I've been praying for and what I'd been wanting to do. But I couldn't see that that's what was happening for a long time, because I had this expectation of what those things would look like when God answered those prayers. And so all that to say, it's been a couple years of me experiencing this very much, where this outer reality that was created on a previous version of myself before I started to do my inner healing work, before I started to seek God on a deeper level and surrender myself and my life to God, to say, hey, what do you want me to be doing? Like, what I am here to fulfill whatever you put me on this earth to do. These are the things I feel led and called to do. Bless me through building these things and creating these things, but ultimately I'm surrendering them to you, and allowing myself to be led by you. And so it's very simple to say a prayer like that. It's a whole other thing to actually be moving by the Spirit and allowing yourself to be led, especially because, and I've done episodes in the past about kind of these different lessons I've learned as I've been walking by the Spirit and moving in faith, while this whole outer reality has been crumbling around me, and everything that I thought was going to happen has not gone the way that I thought. And at times it's been very scary, but it's also remembering that God is still holding you and moving you, carrying through all these things. So some of that, I think, is what Jesus or Yeshua was talking about when he says this in this passage about, if anyone would follow me, let him deny himself and take up his cross. But what he's really getting at, because part of what he says in this passage too is, whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. And then he says something at the end about the material. That's what he's getting at, is letting go of the material things, releasing ourselves from the grip of the material world, the things of the world, but also the ego. And so that's what leads me to this next thing that God had me write down. So he took me to all of these really heavy negative emotions that a lot of us become imprisoned by. Now, this can be one of these, it could be many of them. And there's also, it may not be so the ones he had me write down are like the extreme end of this spectrum. So if on one end of the spectrum are these really heavy negative emotions, the other end of the spectrum is like they're equal opposite, right? Like the more positive, ultimately, like the highest level positive emotions we can have. And then there's everything in between. So as soon as I started to write down the list, as soon as he started to give me the words, I knew he was giving me the 7 deadly sins. But these are actually feelings and emotions, which means they are also an energy. So envy, anger, pride, gluttony, lust, greed, our ego, not that's an emotion, but he was saying that these are all driven by the ego. And then apathy, which I think, in my mind, I was translating that to sloth, because when you're in a state of apathy, it's like you just don't care. It's all like, it's kind of beyond that. So he asked me to write this list down. He was saying these are kind of like the heaviest, most negative emotions. And the reason he gave me this list was, he said, think of the way these things color your view or slant your thinking. So when you are consumed by some of these things, and I have been myself, I know I've been in states of anger where that is how I looked at everything. Even when I thought I wasn't, like when I consciously thought I wasn't necessarily like angry, there was this background level of it that had built up from all the different things that I had experienced that I was holding on to, that were then coloring the way I saw everything, which led me into sort of a victim mentality for a long time. And that's what he's getting at with this list and bringing our attention to these things, because that is what can happen. It starts to color the way you see the world. It starts to affect your perception and how you're looking at everything. And then that's going to affect how you're behaving and how you're acting. He further went on that being consumed by these, you are driven by the darkest parts of your ego. They're contortions of past painful experiences that grow into these extremes. And in this sense, they become like a prison. And this is why he says to surrender these things to him and to put these things down, and why he says my yoke is light, because this is all these heavy emotions are things we self-impose when we don't do the other work, when we don't do the healing work that we're being called to do, that I was talking about sort of at the beginning of this. That healing work is all about forgiveness and releasing these things, which involves going back to trace, like, where did this start? When did I start feeling this way? What are the different stories or past experiences in my life that led me to this level of anger or pride or gluttony or whatever it is, right? And you start to kind of trace that back to get at what were those events and what were the different emotions in those events, and start to be able to release them and forgive them, forgiving the people that are involved with those things and forgiving yourself, which is actually, in some respects, that was almost harder for me in some ways than forgiving the people that did certain things to me. Because when you're confronted with looking at how you allowed these things to mean something about you, to define you in some way, to create a story. In my case, it created a story of, I'm not worthy, I'm not, I'm unlovable, those kinds of things. That's kind of some of the stuff that was going, like, the story that was going in my mind from some of the experiences I've had in my life. So we all have our different versions of them. And that's why the healing work is so important, because by not letting go of those stories and the emotions behind them, or that have been born by holding on to them, we can't really move forward, and we can't fully embody all of these other more positive emotions that are of God. The other thing I'm getting right now is the importance of understanding that these heavier emotions aren't you, and they're not of God. And so when you find yourself feeling these things, it's like trying to remember that, trying to like acknowledge that, and stepping back, like, where is this coming from? Where did I pick this up? And again, going back to figuring out how you can release it and process it and where it originated. So then, again, that's why the inner healing work is so important. And so the other thing, the main kind of takeaway from the revelation I received last night, was that the healing work, us doing our inner healing work, our shadow work, whatever, as unpleasant as it is, as challenging as it can be, but that is what Yeshua is referring to when he says, if anyone would follow me, let him deny himself and take up his cross. That is the cross you are taking up. And for those of you who are the generational curse breakers, who are the chosen ones in your family to do this work and to heal your family line, this is why it's likened to the cross, because you are taking this on for much more than just yourself. One of the things I've learned in my own journey with this is there was a lot that I was processing and carrying that was my dad's. There was a lot I was carrying that was my mom's. There was a lot I was carrying that was my grandparents. And then there was also stuff that was from other lifetimes that, came with me into this one, because I didn't resolve them in those other lives. So all of these things we bring in, and we have the opportunity to heal them and release them in this lifetime, but you have to choose to do the work. This is where we get that whole, the straight and narrow, or the way to hell is wide, and the paths are many, or something like that. That's the two choices. We can either choose to stay on the one road that's, wide with all of these heavy emotions and feeding our ego and perpetuating these things, or we can choose the straight and narrow and doing the healing work and releasing these things and taking up our cross and following the example given to us by Yeshua. And so everything that Yeshua taught us was really about how to do this. It was really the example of, achieving this inner healing in this state of consciousness, and freedom from these heavier emotions so that we can then become closer to God and our own spirit. So the last thing I want to touch on is just the positive emotions that we start to make more room for within ourselves when we do this work, which is really what we want to embody. So as we are doing the work to release these heavier, really intense emotions, we want to be mindful to call in these more positive emotions, the ones that are the exact opposite of these, what we often think of as the 7 deadly sins. And so those emotions are love, gratitude, faith, humility, servitude in the biblical sense, being of service to God, being of service to others, peace, authenticity, and abundance or generosity. So those are the opposite ends of this spectrum of emotions, and the opposites of these negative, heavier emotions that a lot of us may struggle with releasing or carrying or holding on to. And there's nothing, I mean, it's part of being human, and it's part of what we're here to do, is to learn how to become aware of that, and that we have the choice. This is part of what free will is about, is that we have the choice to either continue to hang on to these things and be really wrapped up and primarily driven by the ego, or we can choose to put all of that down and surrender ourselves to God, which is then going to help strengthen our spirit and make our spirit louder or more prominent and enable us to be more led by the Spirit. Which is why I believe, and I've come to understand in my own journey, I know people may have different opinions about this, but that's why I believe God gave us spiritual gifts, but we have to choose to tap into them and surrender to Him and be open to being led. But I believe He gave us things like the clairs, right? Like clairvoyance, clairaudience, claircognizance, so that we can be led by the Spirit. They're the perception system of the Spirit. It's our soul's perceptual system. Just like you can see with the physical body, you can hear with the physical body, you can taste all those things. Your spirit has a sensory system. And the more you do this work and the closer you stay connected to God, the more heightened those things will become. And I believe from my own experience that is how He equips us to walk by the Spirit, so that we can hear Him, so that we have better discernment. And I'll leave it at that for touching on the spiritual gifts aspect of it. But that is what I have for you today. This is what God, the sort of conversation I was having with Him last night, the insight and understanding He's given me around this, as I was kind of having this conversation with Him about, being the generational curse breaker and all this healing work I've been doing, and also kind of asking, like, why did you call me to this? Why did you call me out of what I was doing into this, and how do you want me to use this, and how do you want me to do this? So this was part of what I received, or this was what I received in terms of response for that, and the clarification, I guess, and the guidance to provide all of you that are doing this for your families, that are just starting off on your spiritual path or your inner healing journey, or that have maybe been on it for a while. And those of you that have been on it for a while, we're coming to a time of a lot of this intensive work is kind of coming to an end. A lot of us have completed a lot of that sort of heavier lifting, is what I think of it as. But also more and more people are going to be getting called to it. So part of it is to help other people and help lead them through this process, because it's a challenge. But I can tell you it's the best work you'll ever do, even though it is at times very challenging. So I hope this has been helpful for those of you that this resonated for. And for those of you that are maybe earlier on in this and aren't really sure or still learning, please feel free to reach out to me with any questions. I'd be happy to to help with any questions and help answer anything or provide any support that I can or any guidance that I can for you as you start on this journey yourselves. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you, as always, for tuning in to today's episode. And again, if you're not already, please consider liking and subscribing to this podcast or my YouTube channel. Again, you can find me at Rochelle Renee on YouTube or _faith_fitness_joy_. All right, until Monday, I wish you all a wonderful rest of your week, and I will see you in the next episode of the Faith, Fitness, Joy podcast.